afternoon. My name is Dave Norton from Discovering New England History, and this is episode 4 of the Abolitionists. And so we're going to begin with slide number 1. And this will be abolitionist movement. We'll be talking about quite a few incidents here. So we'll go to the next slide. And we mentioned Amos Lawrence, and that's how they named Lawrence, Kansas. He was a very wealthy man, and he financed Lawrence, Kansas. He was an abolitionist. He financed John Brown's cause. And there's a settlement out in Lawrence. And we'll go to the next slide. Now in Lawrence, Kansas, it was interesting because, as we said in the last episode, we had over 1,000 families from all over New England relocate their whole families over to Kansas, because Kansas, by settling there, they could vote, and they wanted to bring Kansas into the Union as a free state, not a slave state. So they all settled there, and look at all the names of the streets today. I took this off Google Maps. You have a Connecticut street, a Massachusetts street, a Rhode Island street, a Vermont street, and the town named Lawrence, Kansas, from a gentleman from Groton, Massachusetts. So it's amazing how the New England connection now, we're going to talk about Kansas. So we'll go into the next picture. And what they did was they all went to the Freetown Hotel, and they all stayed there until they could build their own homes in Kansas. It's sort of like a way station there. You come there, you stay there, and then you move on. And that's how they did. They settled out in Kansas. So that's why we're talking about New England, but now we're talking about Kansas. We'll go to the next slide. And finally, they voted, and Kansas became a free state January 29th, 1861. And that was right before the Civil War started. We'll go to the next slide. Now, I took this picture when I visited Fort Sumter on April 12th, 1861 now. Of course, with Fort Sumter was bombarded, and that began the American Civil War. So now things have really heated up between the North and the South. We're into a full-fledged Civil War. And that's quite an interesting picture there I took. You have to take a boat to get over there. It's right in the middle of the harbor. We'll go to the next slide. Now, the Antietam. Antietam was a famous battle, and that's what the bridge looked like in Antietam in 1862. And the next slide will show you what it looked like today. And there it is over on the left side of your screen, Antietam. Now, President Lincoln, of course, they lost the first Battle of Bull Run, and General McClellan was down in that area, but he kept on training troops, and he just didn't want to get involved in the fighting until he was sure. He was very cautious, all the troops are ready. And Lincoln was really waiting for a win or something like that so he could issue what they call the Emancipation Proclamation, which would free the slaves in the United States. So the battle was fought September 17th, 1862, and Abe Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which is part of this abolition story, 5 days later. And the battle was not a win for the Union, but it wasn't a loss either. It's historians basically treat it as a tie. But it was, the Union was so hungry for some kind of a victory of sorts that that's what they when they issued the Emancipation Proclamation. So we'll go to the next slide. And shortly after, that's the story here, Harriet Beecher Stowe. She was called to the White House, Washington, D.C., and President Lincoln wanted to meet her. And of course, that was the famous quote, an introduction when he first saw her. He said, "So you are the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war." And of course, that book he referred to was Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Harriet Beecher Stowe, of course, was from New England. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, we're going to talk about the Lawrence Massacre. This happened later in the Civil War, August 21st, 1863. Now, there are a group of guerrilla fighters sympathized with the Confederate Army and under the command of Captain William Quantrill. And their whole idea was to disrupt anything to the Union in Missouri and Kansas. And they were really upset about the abolitionist movement and those in Lawrence, Kansas. So we'll go to the next slide. And Captain William Quantrell, these are quotes that are in the history books. And you got to remember now, Lawrence was settled by all the folks from New England, from all the different states, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Maine, Connecticut. And his quote was, "Lawrence is the great hotbed of abolitionism in Kansas. Lawrence should be thoroughly cleansed, and the only way to cleanse is to kill." And as a Captain William Quantrell, he was a guerrilla outfit attached to the Confederate Army. So we'll go to the next slide. And who are these folks? The leaders, you can see William Quantrell in the middle, and right below him, Captain Kit Dalton. He's a cousin of the famous Dalton brothers, outlaws. They were in command. And of course, they had young folks here. Jesse James was a Quantrell raider. He was only 17. Frank James was older. I think he was approximately 26. Bloody Bill Anderson is the most ruthless killer of all times in the Quantrell's army. And Cole Younger. And they also had 360 of these cavalrymen, Confederate cavalrymen, in Quantrell's raiders. So we'll go to the next slide. And what they did was they completely surrounded the town of Lawrence, 360 cavalrymen on horses. Quantrell gave his speech about cleansing the town, and they charged down Massachusetts Avenue in Kansas. And what they did is, Quantrell has said he had 4 6-guns in his belt. That way he didn't have to reload. And they just came pouring down the street, and they shot and killed anybody who was in the street, and they shot up any window they could, just right down there. And they started going from house to house, torching all the buildings. And we'll go to the next slide. And it was awful what they did. They did killing and plundering. They went from house to house. They had scouted Lawrence a lot earlier, and they knew who was involved and which houses they had to target. They were just calling each owner by name to come out in the street. And if they didn't come out, they would go inside and they'd ransack, take whatever they wanted. Completely pillaged and killed whoever they wanted to. So we'll go to the next slide. And George Cullimore, now he was born in Boston, Massachusetts. He was actually a general in the Union Army, in charge of all the forces in Kansas. And they actually made him the mayor of Lawrence, Kansas also, because Kansas was certainly the hotbed of abolitionism, and he was an abolitionist. And Kansas, was there, and they wanted somebody really firmly in charge to take charge of the town. And this was quite a story. When the raiders came through town, they knew where his house was. They came in his house, and they surrounded his house, and he came out to talk with them, and they just didn't want to hear anything he had to say. And he could tell he wasn't going to get in. He pleaded that so they wouldn't burn his house or anything like that. And you could see going around and back of him what the raiders were doing as they were going from house to house, shooting and killing like that. So he ran for his life back in his house, and the raiders dismounted their horses, chased him in the house. He went from room to room, shutting the door, and they kept on shooting him, and they kept on hitting him. Then he went downstairs in the cellar. He was cornered. And what they did is his wife stood in front of him to try to protect him. They pushed his wife aside, and they shot him and killed him dead right there in his house. The mayor, that was one of the officials of the town that the raiders wanted to kill. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, the Lawrence massacre, I just wonder here, there might be, believe it or not, a Rumford, Rhode Island or a Seekonk, Massachusetts connection. I did some history. I did a lot of research on a lot of these books here. And there is a list on the internet of all the victims that were killed in the Lawrence massacre. Over 200 men and boys of teenagers, if you will, were killed in this massacre. The raiders were not after the women or the children. But if you go back to that slide we just showed, a couple of names I read in his book on William Quantrell sort of struck me a little bit here. I've done a lot, of course, on King Philip's War, and I had the Ring of the Green, and they listed all the early settlers in 1676 and the Ring of the Green, which is in Rumford, Rhode Island. And the name Carpenter, Fuller, and Reed really stuck out. And so I did some reading here, and some of the survivors of this Lawrence massacre were in fact the name. Now they may be, and most likely are actually relatives or of the early settlers on the Ring of the Green. Now there was a judge named Lewis Carpenter. He was shot and killed. They came to his house, and he ran for his life, and his wife tried to save him. So what he did is he ducked out of his house. There was an attached building that had a well in it. And so he lowered himself down into the well, and the raiders went through the whole house and couldn't find him. And his wife called after they left, and she said, "Are you okay?" And he says, "Yes, I'm fine." She said, "Well, don't come out yet." And then what happened was the raiders set fire to his house. And after the fire burnt down the house, she went inside, and he was found dead at the bottom of the well. So the burning timbers from the house fell down, and he died there. And he may have been from the famous carpenters that first settled here in Rumford. Then there was a Dr. Fuller. All they say in the research book I did was that he survived. And a lot of these folks went out the back door. There were a lot of cornfields around. They made a dash into the cornfields. Some were gunned down. Some of the raiders surrounded the cornfields, and anybody that moved, they shot and killed them. And some escaped. So Dr. Fuller survived, and Fred Reed and his wife survived. And that's quite a story. These women were very, very defiant, and they stood up, and they were extremely courageous. The raiders came to the house of Fred Reed, and she told them to go up on the second floor and hide. She said, "I'll handle this." So she went out to the front steps and talked to them. They said, "We're going to burn your house down. Where's your husband?" She said, "He's not here." He said, "Well, we're going to burn it down anyway." So they pushed her aside, and he tried to strike a match on her piano to get to start setting fire. And every time he lit the match, she blew out the match right in his face. Can you imagine that? And these people, these guerrillas, they're half drunk and everything else, and they, with their weapons, it's got to be a terrorizing thing. So they set fire to her house, and then they left. So what she did was, fine, they're not going to burn my house down. So she took the furniture that they set on fire, opened up the windows, and just threw the furniture out in the street and put the fire out. So they had another group of guerrillas came down the street and knocked on the door again and said, "We're going to burn your house down." And she said, "No, you're not." So they took her, dragged her out in the street, held her by her wrist, went in, and they set all the furniture on fire up on the second floor. And they said, "Now try to put it out." And then they got on their horses and went down the street. So she went up on the second floor, and she covered herself in a wet blanket, and she took the pillows once again, pushed all the furniture out and saved the house. So after the raid, her and her husband, the Reed family, they actually survived and told their story. It's quite a story. I think if some historians here in perhaps Rhode Island, Massachusetts, did a genealogical search, it'd be interesting to find out if these families are actually related to the original families that were in the Ring of the Green in Rumford. So it's a bit of history, New England tie, and actually a local tie that perhaps a lot of people don't even realize. So we'll go to the next slide. And this was called the most diabolical deed of the Civil War. Think about that. All the battles fought between the soldiers, all the killing and everything else. This one here was just absolutely awful. Had 360 Quantrill raiders rode into town. They killed 200 civilian men, whether they were armed or not, they didn't care, and boys randomly killed. Women and children ran for their lives. Houses were robbed and then torched. Men were hung from balconies. All but 2 buildings were burnt to the ground, and the whole chaos and massacre lasted for a total of 4 hours. Amazing. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, after the Lawrence Massacre, we'll go back here to New England. Harriet Beecher Stowe, she moved to Hartford, Connecticut in 1864, and I was there, and I took a picture of her house. It's a museum now, and that's quite an interesting tour. And we'll go to the next slide. And that's from the backyard. You can see that is one nice house that she settled the rest of her life in Hartford, Connecticut. So we'll go to the next slide. And she's buried in Andover, Massachusetts. Now we're going to go down here to sort of summarize some of our story here, what all these folks are. We'll go to the next slide. Senator Charles Sumner, he was the fellow that was caned on the Senate floor, beaten down and beaten in the head and knocked down while the Senate was in session. He's buried, that's his grave site, Cambridge, Massachusetts. Go to the next picture. Henry David Thoreau, he was an abolitionist, of course, from Concord. And I went to found his cemetery, and that's in Concord, Massachusetts. That's his gravestone on the right. And we'll go to the next one. Ralph Waldo Emerson, he's also one in Concord, and that's quite a nice monument there. And we'll go to the next slide. Bronson Alcott, who I am direct descendant of the Alcott family, and that's where he's buried in Concord, Massachusetts. He's a famous abolitionist, and he was the one that had John Brown's wife over for tea after Harper's Ferry in his house, and he also was part of the Underground Railroad for 2 years in Concord and helped slaves on their way to freedom up in Canada. And we'll go to the next slide. Captain William Quantrell. Now, he didn't survive the Civil War. He was he and his group were in Kentucky, and they were cornered in a barn. They had a shootout, and he was shot in the back, fell off his horse, paralyzed from the waist down. They dragged him into a hospital to try to save him, I guess, and that's how he died. And he's buried from where he was originally from in Dover, Ohio. And we'll go to the next slide. And of course, Jesse James survived the Civil War, and there's his wanted poster, his famous outlaw. We'll go to the next slide. Frank James, also, he was 9 years older than Jesse. He actually survived and lived to a grand old age. He survived everything and survived riding with Frank and Jesse James gang. We'll go to the next slide. And Cole Younger, that's another part of the Jesse James gang, and he was also a prominent member of Quantrell's Raiders. We'll go to the next slide. And this was interesting. I went down to Memphis, Tennessee, to a Civil War graveyard, and I was just randomly going through because I'd never seen a Civil War where some of the soldiers were buried, and I came across this stone that caught my eye, and it says Captain Kit Dalton. And of course, I knew he was one of the Quantrell's Raiders, and I found his picture on the internet, and that's his gravestone. And it's the most remarkable gravestone. They completely tell the story of his life in there for history, and I'll show you the picture on the next slide. And I'll read you what you have. What it says. This is verbatim right off of the gravestone. He fought for the Confederacy and with Quantrell's Raiders. After the war, he rode with Jesse and Frank James and Cole Younger. Over 100 years ago, a $50,000 reward was offered for him, dead or alive. Since they could not capture him, he was later pardoned by several governors with the promise that he would leave an exemplary life, which he did during the last 20 years in Memphis. And that's his gravesite. I mean, I've visited a lot of gravesite over the years, but that's to put that all together in context, that's quite a story. We'll go to the next slide. Now, John Brown, he originally from Torrington, Connecticut, and I looked up and I did some research, and his original house where he was born, the foundation is still there, way out in the country in Torrington on a lonely road out there. And so here's John Brown. I took this picture. This is the actual site of his original house. That's quite a monument. You can see it says John Brown, his name on it. Quite a stone there. It's out in the country. There's no houses around or anything like that. Torrington, Connecticut. So we'll go to the next slide. And that's what it looks like. You can see part of his original foundation there. It's really interesting. It's a part of history. The house actually was survived the Civil War, and it actually burned down around the early 20th century. But it's a memorial right there. And we'll go to the next slide. And you can see there's his stone. You can see all the stones around there marking where the foundation was. And you go to the next slide. And that's another part. I looked that up, and that's one of his sheds, which wasn't attached to his house. And this next slide is going to be interesting. I think you'll probably recognize what it was used for, but we'll go to the next slide. I really, when I took a look at that, I said, what in the world is this? It doesn't look like a well to me or whatever, and it's about 25 feet away from his house. And what it is, it's the base of John Brown's outhouse. And generally that's what they did. They had the steps there, and they usually had a stone there, and they built a wooden outhouse on top of it. So you really never know what you're going to find when you visit some of these historic sites. So we'll go to the next picture. Now, he moved, of course, we said he moved to North Elba, New York, and that's his homestead. And that's another place that's a museum that you can actually go through and see. And of course, that's where from there he went down to, of course, Maryland, and was involved in the Harper's Ferry raid. We'll go to the next slide. And this is quite a story. He wanted to be buried in New York before he died, buried by a large rock. And if you take a look over on the left side of the screen, you can almost see his gravestone there, and it's all encased in glass so it won't get weathered. And that stone originally came from Collinsville, Connecticut, and that's where his grandfather was born. And the top half of the stone was already, with the inscription on it from his grandfather. And he noticed that when he was in Collinsville. This was before Harper's Ferry. And he said, well, gee, it was just cast aside on the side of the road. He said, I'm going to take that to New York, and if anything ever happens to me, I will just inscribe my name on the bottom of that. And that's essentially what he did. So we'll go to the next slide. And if you can see on the top part of the stone there, that's his grandfather, that's his early stone. In the bottom half, he inscribed his name down there, and also his son, Oliver. His remains were taken there to New York, and Oliver was one of his two sons that were killed in Harper's Ferry in West Virginia. They were actually captured there, and he was captured, and his son was killed when the militia overpowered the engine house that we talked about in a previous episode. So what I want to do is, we'll go to the next slide here. We'll go to the next slide next. The last slide. And in our presentation here, we've had, this is our 4th episode, of course, and we've talked about the New England Connection. We've talked about Harriet Beecher Stowe, of course, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Then we talked about Amos Lawrence, who was the very wealthy businessman from Boston, and he financed Lawrence, Kansas, that whole abolition movement and the settlers that went out to Kansas. And of course, John Brown from Torrington, Connecticut. He was involved in that famous raid in Harper's Ferry, and he was hanged down in West Virginia after that as treason for taking up arms against the United States government. And then we've got Bronson Alcott. He was a famous abolitionist, originally from Wolcott, Connecticut, and he moved to Concord. And his first house for 2 years, they had was part of the Underground Railroad, and there's a monument there for his daughter, of course, was Louisa May Alcott, who wrote Little Women. There's a monument there to him as participating in the Underground Railroad. Then we have Charles Blair. He's the one from Collinsville, Connecticut, who was a forge master and forged all those pikes made for John Brown, which were supposed to be for the slave uprising down at the Harper's Ferry. And then we also have Charles Sumner. He was the congressman from Massachusetts, the senator who was struck down on the Senate floor after making a speech about against slavery. And so these are the stories we had. And also, we've got a few minutes here. If you take a look on my desk here, we've got 3 books that are incredible about Kansas. Bloody Bill Anderson, that's the only book written, I found out. And he was just an absolute merciless killer. Some of the stories are chilling, what he would do. I mean, he would, if he shot you and you weren't dead in the street, he would stand over you and then talk to you as he was reloading his 6-gun, and then he would shoot you again. I mean, he was just brutal. He did not survive the Civil War. We'll go to the next book. And this book, The Devil Knows How to Ride, William Quantrell. That's all the information I got from the folks from New England and his life. And then the final book, which is a biography actually written by Kit Dalton, who was one of, that's his book. That's a hard book to get. And he wrote his whole story of everything to do with the Lawrence Massacre when he was with Quantrell's Raiders, and also his life with Frank and Jesse James. And I wonder how many people think about it in New England never knew that their relatives could have been killed in Lawrence by Frank and Jesse James and Quantrell's Raiders. That's an interesting part of history in New England. So once again, this is Dave Norton. I hope you enjoyed the programs on abolitionists, and have a good evening.